Good afternoon and welcome to today's presentation. Advanced Topics in Valuing Economic Damages in Personal Injury Litigation. The information presented by the expert is not to be used as legal advice and does not indicate a working relationship with the expert. All materials obtained from this presentation are merely for educational purposes and should not be used in a court of law sans the expert's consent, i.e. a business relationship where she or he is hired for your particular case. In today's webinar, Nora will discuss projecting post-injury earnings, projecting earnings for plaintiffs without an earning history, determining the reasonable value of medical expenses, measuring personal consumption, approaches to valuing household services, using actuarial data to project the period of loss, valuing income in retirement, discounting to present value, and putting it all together, review it in an economist report. To give you a little background about our presenter, Nora Ostrofe has served as a forensic economist for the past 19 years. She has a bachelor's degree in economics from the University of California, Los Angeles, an MBA from St. Mary's College, and a certificate in accounting with distinction from the University of California. Attending to acquire passcode, the word for today is personal. During the Q&A session, we ask that you enter this passcode into the Q&A widget for CLE reporting purposes. The Q&A is located to the left of your screen. Please remember that if you are applying for CLE credit, you must have logged on to the computer as yourself and stay for the full 90 minutes. You're also required to complete the survey at the end of the program. Please note that CLE credit could not be given to those watching together on a single computer. Tomorrow morning, we will send out an email with the link to the archive recording of the webinar. The slides can be downloaded from the resource list at the widget at the bottom of your screen. Thank you all for attending today, and Nora, the presentation is now turned over to you.
Okay. Well, good morning, good afternoon to all of you. There's a number of you. I've heard that there's 236 of you today, and I just wanted to give you a little backstory. Last year, I presented an initial webinar, Personal Injury 1, where I went over valuing economic damages in personal injury, and the response was overwhelming. I think it was the highest attendance for a webinar given by TASA ever, and the site crashed, and so I wasn't able to take questions from the audience, and I got huge numbers of email questions. I spent about the next 2 months responding to them. So I don't know how many of you will have questions, but if I don't get to them within the webinar, my email address is at the end of this presentation. Send me an email and I will get back to you, although it might take me a couple of weeks because I'll be on travel for the rest of the week and some of the questions are highly technical and take me some time to respond. Okay, so on this one, I'm going to go into the topics that Rochelle described, and I'm going to go into these particular topics in a little bit more depth. The presentation isn't highly technical, but it starts out light and sort of gets progressively more technical, so if you feel like it's a little lightweight for the first couple of slides, be patient because we're going to get into the meat of it pretty soon. All right. Those are just the topics. Okay, so the first question is we have a personal injury case, and the question is what happens when an injured plaintiff returns to work? Okay, and if the plaintiff has not yet returned to work, you've got a personal injury case, they haven't gone back, the sort of open question in the case is what is the plaintiff going to be able to do given their injuries? And so when the economist has to project forward what they're going to earn once they come back, the treating physician may say, okay, you know, on this date, we're going to expect that the person is permanent and stationary and they can go back to work, but we don't know, especially if they have a physical occupation, what they're going to be able to do. You might want to find out if there are work restrictions. Another physician has said you can't stoop, you can't sit for longer than this without getting up and moving around, you can't lift more than 50 pounds. How is that? The economist is going to want to anticipate how that's going to affect the plaintiff's future earnings. Are they going to be able to do certain types of work? Are they going to be able to work overtime? Are they going to be able to work to their full work-life expectancy? Or would they be expected to have the injury to exacerbate perhaps degenerative changes, degenerative aspects of their health, and they may have to retire earlier than they otherwise would? Another question, is the employer going to accommodate the plaintiff? if accommodations are required by physicians. Employers are required by law to accommodate plaintiffs if they're able to, but sometimes they may not, and you may have to be looking into retraining the plaintiff for another occupation. While the plaintiff was out or when they go back, will they experience any lost opportunities? For instance, promotions, they lost clients, they lost seniority, they may have lost retirement service years. That's going to affect their future earnings. And will the plaintiff be off work for future medical procedures that, so, if they're going to have surgery in 5 years and they're going to be expected to be out of work for 3 months, that's going to be a future loss that the economist has to account for. And I would caution both whether you're defending a personal injury case or if you're promoting a personal injury case, you do want to think ahead to these things. When I work on the defense, I often see that the defense attorney has been blindsided. They assume that the period of loss is while the plaintiff was out of work, and they are not prepared with experts in terms of physicians or IMEs or vocational experts to respond to a claim of future lost earnings. And often plaintiff attorneys have not necessarily thought ahead about that until the last minute, and all of a sudden they're trying to get a number to put on that anticipated future period of loss. So it's something to be thinking of at the inception of the case, not all of a sudden as you're going to trial, all of a sudden you have to take account of these future probabilities. Okay, if the plaintiff has returned to work, but only for a short period of time, they may not really have, so in other words, we don't have this open question, what are they going to be able to do? They've gone back to their previous occupation, but it may be, for instance, people in construction, we only have 6 months worth of data about what they're able to do once they're back on the job, and we have to project what their earnings are going to be 20 years hence. So that's a question. Has the plaintiff been at work long enough to establish his or her post-injury earning ability? In other words, are they going to be able to maintain these current hours that they're working? Did they come back fresh because they had a rest, but they're not going to be able to sustain the number of hours or the pace that they're able to do? Would productivity decline with time, or are they expected to continue to improve as time goes on and soon they'll be back to normal? One thing an economist might want to do is project future earning capacity with a couple of different productivity rates. If their injury begins to act up, they're only expected to do this. If they're doing really well, maybe they'll just be 100%. Okay, another question is that I want to look forward to is, could the plaintiff eventually transfer to a less physically demanding position? Could they go from a laborer to a foreman maybe and be directing other people to do the physical work they can no longer do? Or do they work in a large company and there's a sedentary position that they could do, that they could be retrained for, or so forth? These are all questions to be asking yourself at the inception of the case. If the plaintiff can't return to his or her pre-injury occupation, one of the considerations are projected alternate occupations realistic. For a long time, I did a lot of construction worker cases, and every injured construction worker was going to go back to work as a construction estimator if they had at least a high school diploma and could do basic math. But it seemed like there were a lot of construction estimators out there in the workforce. So just because a vocational expert has, selected a position that they can now do with their injury, you may want to go a little bit further and ask yourself if this is really realistic. Is this something that the plaintiff wants to do? Is this something that the plaintiff has made positive concrete efforts to do? Is this the thing that the plaintiff can do that is their highest and best use of themselves, where they can earn the most money? Okay, are projected alternate occupations low-balled or high-balled, depending on which side the expert is on? Sometimes those numbers get skewed so that they mitigate immediately, or they never mitigate, and there's a lot of jobs and possibilities in the world. So we want to be looking at all of those and not just assuming they can do one thing. Would the plaintiff have a different work-life expectancy in the alternate occupation? For instance, if somebody say has a high school degree, is injured, goes back and gets a bachelor's degree, people with bachelor's degree tend to work longer. So their ability to work longer may have been enhanced by that retraining. Okay. Has the plaintiff taken any concrete steps towards actually working in this occupation? Okay. If they haven't done it, why not? Okay. And would the plaintiff's injury affect his or her performance in a new occupation? Sometimes if they have a mental injury, it's going to affect them no matter what they do. Okay. Any questions? All right. Question number 1. What can a defense attorney do to anticipate and be ready for claims of future lost earnings after an injured employee has returned to work? I would say that at the outset of the case, I would always retain a vocational expert and possibly an independent medical examiner. Okay, you may not have to use them, but in the event that you're going into settlement negotiations and all of a sudden you have this claim of future lost earnings that you hadn't seen before and you've anticipated it, okay? And then you have experts retained, you can go back to them, here's a claim for future lost earnings, there's something they're not going to be able to do, or they're going to be returned to work in a reduced earning capacity, or they're going to be out of work for future surgery. What are we looking at here? And you are prepared. What I often see on the defense side is that the defense attorney has the date for retaining experts has come and gone. All of a sudden, there are these new claims that they hadn't anticipated, and they didn't have the experts on board to respond to them, and they end up settling the case. All right, moving on. What do I find is the best way to estimate the effect of stress and anxiety? That's a really good question. I would say that sometimes an IME could go into that, and perhaps they may need psychological counseling, and that would be a future medical expense. They may need some sort of I don't know, yoga. Maybe they need yoga classes. So maybe they need some kind of therapy. So that would be something that if you were representing a plaintiff that has stress and anxiety issues caused by the injury that need to be addressed, that's where you're going to have to get either a life care planner or a physician to diagnose it, project future medical expenses, and then you turn those numbers, what kind of therapy will they need, how frequently will they need it, how long will it cost, what's the duration, will they need it for the rest of their lifetime, or would they need it maybe just for the next 5 years or the next year, or so forth, and then your economist can cost that out and add that to damages. Okay, are there programs that help with estimating future lost earnings? I'm assuming somebody's talking about a computer program, and there are websites, there are economist websites, you can do a search that will have a very bare bones, you sort of plug in a number, this is the plaintiff's earnings rate, this is their age, this is their gender, and it will cost something out. If you want to do that, that may be a very rudimentary calculation for you if you just want to go ahead and settle the case. If you and you're willing to take a very broad-brushed approach. I hesitate to do that because sometimes somebody's earning $50,000. They could have worked 10 more years. They're not going to be able to do that, so we'll just take $50,000 and multiply it by 10, and there are damages. When you do something like that, what you are overlooking is, the value of benefits. If the plaintiff has an employer contribution to medical benefits, he could be overlooking $6,000 to $12,000 a year. If the plaintiff has a retirement plan or a pension plan, you could be looking over a substantial amount of money that an economist could help you with. So those are considerations. Generally, if you think it will help you, you can certainly do that, and that's your first pass. And then as the case develops, you may want additional expertise, or you may just want to go with a very rough number. Okay, I'm going to move on. All right, so projecting earnings for an injured plaintiff with no work history. Okay, so what are the earnings of a plaintiff who has never worked before? This frequently comes up when we have cases that involve infants or bad baby cases, birth injury, and we don't have an idea of what that child has no earnings, and we have no real information on what their probable earnings are going to be. In those cases, what we'll do is we'll look at the parent's educational attainment, and then children's educational attainment usually surpasses their parents by a little bit. So let's say both their parents have a high school degree. We might say they would get an associate degree in college or so forth, and look at that and project forward earnings based on their education. But these can also come up, for instance, you might have someone who's been a homemaker who's expected to return to work and perhaps has a bachelor's degree. There might be some people who are totally disabled and are going to go back and get some sort of degree and then go back into the workforce, but they don't know what they're doing yet. Or somebody who just has never been in the workforce but intended to go into it. So those are the situations where we have to look at somebody who doesn't have any actual past earnings and determine what they could make. Okay, so fortunately the government has helped us out, and what they have are the pink tables. That's what economists use them, but they're personal income tables that are compiled by the U.S. Census Bureau. And the U.S. Census Bureau, it does do a census every 10 years, but it also does very detailed surveys on an annual basis where they have people who call up a statistically representative sample of U.S. households, and they interview them. And they find out, how frequently people are working, when they were out of the labor force, what their earnings are, and they get very precise data sort of on statistical averages of people in the United States. So the pink tables will provide earnings levels for every 5 years for people by age, race, and gender from the ages 18 to 75 and over, and can serve as a rough proxy for the changes in earnings over people's working lives. And what we do is we call those the age earnings profile. All right. So here's an example, and it's a little squinchy on my screen, but if you'll look at this table, you see it takes people from age 18 out to age 75 from each possible level of educational attainment from less than 9th grade up until a doctorate degree. And if you look at, this is for all races, mean earnings, and all sexes, okay? So this is just sort of a broad profile of what people earn by education. And you'll notice the real winners over here are those with a professional degree who pretty much out-earn even people with doctorates. And then the people who sort of have lost out are the people over the lowest earnings, less than 9th grade or high school, okay? So those are projected earnings by education, all right? And looking at this a little bit more closely over people's prime earnings years, here we have both sexes, all races, mean earnings, and we go from 30 to 34. So this is where people are really in the workforce and typically earning, and you can get a rough approximation depending on what you project, the educational attainment you project someone would attain, whether they'd be a high school graduate, and receive a doctorate, receive a professional degree, what they would earn over their lifetime. So often if there's a case where there's an infant injury and we are projecting losses for that plaintiff's entire career, we're going to cost this out. And so we're going to give them, for the ages of 30 to 34, we're going to give them about, and let's assume that they had a bachelor's degree, we're going to give them $63,000, and we're going to build in wage increases, and we're going to value all that out and come up with a number. And that's what their lifetime earnings would be expected to be. All right. Now, what is interesting, and just recently happened this summer in California, and may be headed to your state if you aren't practicing in California, is California decided that using these tables reflected an inherent bias. In other words, people who are minorities or women are earning, who are polled by the Census Bureau and whose earnings appear in the pink tables are victims of historical bias. And so if we were taking an infant today and projecting forward what they might earn over their career, we would be using earnings that had been decreased by bias in the current workforce. And they decided that this is unfair to plaintiffs to project forward earnings that reflect historical bias. So they've decided that what we will have to do is when we have such a case, say a minority female, we have to use earnings that are not reduced for the person, that individual being a minority, and that individual's gender. So, and here they say, nearly one-half economists surveyed by the National Association of Forensic Economics, that would be NAFE, say they consider race, and 92% consider gender when projecting earning potential for an injured person, including children. So they're pointing out that we use what they consider to be bias tables, and results are a reflection of gender pay gaps and workforce discrimination, and they fail to account for possible progress or individual achievement. Okay, so these are biased. So the final conclusion is estimations, measures, or calculations of past, present, or future damages for lost earnings or impaired earning capacity resulting from personal injury or wrongful death shall not be reduced on race, ethnicity, or gender. Now, how this is going to play out in the courts and what kind of estimates they are going to require is a question. The tables can be, you can get tables that are for both sexes or for males, because if you use both sexes, that might be, those averages might be reduced by including females' earnings. And if you use all races, you might, that also might be bringing those averages down. So I don't know if the guidance on this is that we use white male earnings for everyone, or if we just use earnings for both genders and all races, because we don't have enough case history at this point to determine exactly what the guidance from the courts is going to be. But this may be, since it started in California, this may be the future in terms of projecting earnings, and race and gender can no longer be considerations. All right. Now, if we do have a plaintiff that does have an occupation or has suggested, let's say somebody, we have a plaintiff who's in college and they are majoring in, or they know what they want to do. Then we can, and they've specified an occupation, we also have government data that will give us earnings by area and occupation, and it's very detailed data. There are 800, we have wages nationwide, which we can project if we don't know where the person is ultimately going to end up working, but we assume it's somewhere in the United States. We have it statewide data, and then we have it by metropolitan statistical area. So if we know the exact city they're going to work in, we've got that wage data too. Okay, so let's take a look at this. So this is national wage data, and you'll see that it starts out with all occupations, and it goes to certain groups of occupations. So these would be management, and then we have executives. All right. So there's going to be detailed jobs, and then it's going to give us the H's are for hourly, okay, and the A's are for annual. So it's going to give us, and the mean is an average. So it's going to give us average wages for, I've highlighted chief executives, by hour, by year. And then it's going to give us something which is kind of helpful here. It's going to give us a range. So where we have the HPCT 10, HPCT 25, H median, and HPCT 75, those are percentiles. So the 10th percentile means that this would be 90% of people would be above this level. This would be the bottom 10%. Okay, so the bottom 10% of chief executives nationally earn $32.86 an hour. Okay, bottom quarter, that would be the 25th percentile, earn 55.75. The median, that would be the 50th percentile. That means 50% are below that and 50% are above. So this is sometimes kind of a nice middle number that people like to use, is 91.15. And then we have the top 25%, which would be the 75th percentile, and we just have a number there. So for this particular occupation, that means that the Bureau of Labor Statistics didn't have enough respondents to give a number, but we have it for other categories, such as top executives, 78.81. Okay. We also have this for states, so we can drill down and say, okay, that's what executives earn nationally, but what do they earn by state? Let's look at New York. Okay, and the New York average would be about $220K a year, and as you can see, we don't have some of the data for the other categories. Why? Because our sample is getting smaller. We're going from the nation to the state. Okay, and then we have it for metropolitan statistical areas. This is for San Francisco. We have chief executives, and we see that on average they earn more than New York, $255K. We have the 25th percentile, and then again, we don't have data for some of the other categories. All right. So that is if we have somebody who's determined what occupation we're going to go into. We have databases we can look at and find out sort of broad averages by occupation. And that's usually considered to be very reliable data because it's put together by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They send out surveys to employers. They get responses back. They can definitely show you what the margin of error is and how those numbers were determined and so forth. So usually if economists use that as a data source, they don't get a whole lot of pushback on it. Okay, questions for this particular area? Not seeing it. Okay. Oh, when it says attendees must enter in the passcode, so if we can take a 1-second break, I can let them know before getting to the questions above. Okay, no questions. All right, so next category is determining the reasonable value of medical expenses. This again is something that has occurred recently in California and appears to be moving across the country as well, and that is typically, and in the past, what we had is if we had a plaintiff with future medical expenses, what would be claimed would be the fee-for-service rate. In other words, that would be the amount that is charged for the service, for a surgery, or for a particular procedure, and it would just be sort of the face value of it. Like if you got a hospital bill, this is what this costs, okay? But medical providers generally almost never get the sort of nominal rate that they charge because they have arrangements with Medicare and they have arrangements with medical insurance providers that in which they are willing to take less in order to bring in people with that kind of coverage. So for a while, the defense bar was quite upset at having to pay out a fee-for-service rate when everybody knew that the provider was actually accepting something less than that in payment. So there was some case precedent wherein the courts decided that the defense could introduce evidence of what was typically paid for a particular medical procedure as the reasonable cost, and the jury could consider the fact that while this might be the nominal charge, typically what the medical provider, the hospital, or the physician would accept in payment would be something less. And so now, very often, when you have a claim for future medical expenses, both plaintiff and defendant will introduce the reasonable value as a proxy for what will actually be accepted in payment and sort of an alternative for what the jury could consider in terms of determining what future medical expenses are. So as I said, reasonable value can be rates that are charged by nearby providers for the same services. The rate Medicare would pay, that would probably be the lowest value. The rates that the provider has accepted in the past, or the rates that the provider has contracted with other parties. And that's generally what the provider has contracted with a particular insurance group to accept in payment for a particular procedure. Okay, and plaintiffs now typically here, it's not just the defense that's introducing the reasonable value, the plaintiffs are too, because they want it to be not their number, not that of the defendants. So here's an example. This was a case that I worked on, and the nominal charges for it was for hip surgery. So the nominal charges, if you looked at the bills, were $78,000, but what was actually accepted in payment for those services with $13,900. So there was a huge difference between the nominal charges for the medical procedures and what was actually paid. So that's something to consider, particularly for people in the defense of the case, is seeing if they can introduce evidence of what the actual charge is rather than just what the quoted price is. Okay, questions about this?
Thanks, Nora. So all the attendees can enter in the passcode, which is personal, and any questions that you may have. And Nora, you should be getting those questions now.
Okay. What about other influences which affect the market, such as age and ethnicity? That's a really good question. Typically, age is reflected. If you have someone on the job market, and we do have some data about the length of time, the longer amount of time that it will take a person to obtain a particular job based on their age or their gender, although that data is not necessarily broken out by rate, but that's just length of time to employment. We have the earnings, we have the pink tables, which will show sort of, if you look at them broken out by races, you can see that, and gender, you can see that even with the same educational attainment, there are different levels of earnings. Now, whether or not you could apply that differential to a specific occupation, I haven't seen that done. Okay, how much can your vocational rehabilitation expert discuss future losses without being challenged as not being an economist? Okay, well, first of all, there are some vocational experts that do have a credential that will allow them to project future losses. So you could look for a vocational expert who does do that and ask what their qualifications are for doing economic damages, as well as the vocational review. But typically what will happen is the vocational expert will look into this and give the number to the economist, and then the economist will project it forward over the period of loss and discount it to present value. But that's expensive, so you may want to talk to your vocational expert and your economist, get them talking to each other. Maybe you can just get a quick verbal quote, not a huge report from your vocational expert. Your economist puts that into their report, and you wait, you just deal with that, try to settle the case without going into a full-bore report that you have to pay thousands of dollars for. Okay, where can plaintiff and defendants get information on insurance reimbursement rates and patient copays? Generally, if you get the patient's, billing records, they will list what was charged and what was accepted in payment. Also, many hospitals will have somebody on staff who deals with precisely this issue, because, we are in a situation in America where people have difficulty meeting medical expenses, and many people aren't covered. So usually if you phone the hospital's billing department where the work is being done, you can talk to them, and sometimes the hospital will even cut deals. They may give you a break if you're paying in cash, for instance, or if they're not expecting to get any payment at all. So I would start there and then work out. If the patient has medical insurance and coverage, you can try contacting the insurance company and finding out what their capitated rate is for a particular market or a particular provider. Okay, going back to this question. How does one account for the gender pay gap for a woman, for example, that she might have been out of the workforce for a period of time due to child rearing? How does one counter the argument that in securing more money for a female plaintiff? Well, that's a problem. Generally, and I also review books for Publishers Weekly, and I've read a number of books where women, even highly compensated professional women in high income jobs, if they step down for a couple of years and they try to go back, they usually fall off the ladder, and they pay a fairly steep penalty for that. I don't know that the law provides you compensation for that. It is a reality. What you can look at is, I know this has started in the legal profession, which generally is sort of forward-looking, and I don't know that it's gone others, but some companies do have ramp-back programs where they were losing, for instance, a highly compensated female partner. They'd go off and have a child, and they wanted to bring that person back because they were valuable, and so they'd have a whole program where they would work with them and bring them back to their prior level. That might be something you'd want to look at. It would probably be large companies that might have a program, and see if they have a way to ramp that person back. I don't know if that answers the question. That the gender pay gap, it is what it is. Or I guess if you wanted to say that's unfair, you would look at what a male of similar professional background and experience and education would be earning in that occupation, and that would be your benchmark. Okay. All right. So now we're going to move over to personal consumption, and this is in wrongful death cases where what we want to do is we want to measure the loss of support to survivors. And those would be people who were financial dependents of the decedent. Decedent earned income, that income would accrue to those people, and now that the breadwinner is deceased, they have an economic loss. And so what we want to do is look at what the decedent made, what they would be expected to consume, and what would be left over for the economic dependents. All right, so what is personal consumption and maintenance? Okay, that's a measure of the income that the decedent would have consumed from personal or household income, or for personal expenses or survival. I should explain personal maintenance. Some states, for instance, Pennsylvania, and I think Hawaii, do not look at personal consumption. They just look at personal maintenance. Maintenance is a little bit different. Maintenance is just what that person would be expected to spend based on station life for food, shelter, medical attention, and some recreation. So it's going to be a lesser figure than personal consumption. It's going to be what would they have been expected to spend on the basic necessities for survival. If they went out and bought a Porsche every year, we don't care about that. We just want to know what they needed for food, shelter, entertainment, medical care, and so forth, and we're going to deduct that, and everything else is left to give to the survivors. Okay, personal consumption is going to be the portion of household income that would have been used to purchase goods and services that would have been consumed by the adult members of the household if there had been no wrongful death. Now, what would the decedent have spent on himself or herself? Okay, and that's another question where we go back to government data. Okay, we will estimate personal consumption looking at studies that the government conducts on what United States consumers spend on themselves on average. And again, the household goes out, the government goes out, they do survey, Bureau of Labor Statistics surveys household on an annual basis, and it's extremely detailed. They go back and they they look at household size, how many people are in the household. Is it one person? Is it two people? Is it three people? Is it four people? Is it five people? Okay, and then they look at household income. Is the household income $45,000 a year? Is the household income $150,000 a year? And then they look at all their expenditures, and they figure out in very precise categories like meat, transportation, food, gas, electricity, and so forth, and they break it all out, and they come up with these averages of what people spend per year. Okay, and then what economists will do is they'll go back and they'll use that data, and they'll manipulate it and try to figure out what a particular person, by gender and by household income, would be expected to spend on themselves. And then what they do is they take a percentage. What percentage would that person be expected to spend of all the money that comes into the household? And that's their personal consumption rate. So this is just a table from the Consumer Expenditure Survey. You can see we have all consumers. We have an average for, let's say, transportation. So if for households less than $15,000 for household income, they spend about $3,400. For households where the household income is $200,000 and above, they spend about $20,000. Okay, so again, very, very detailed healthcare and so forth. And then we have sort of a share, what percentage is it of household income that they spend in that particular category and so forth. So then we look at that, and then we come back to something that's a personal consumption table. Okay, and this is going to be organized by gender, the number of persons in a household, and household income level. It may provide different percentages depending on whether household members are working or non-working. It may provide specific data depending on a decedent's specific circumstances, whether or not they're single or living alone, in which case people who are single and living alone consume practically all of their income, as opposed to people who are in a household with other people where they consume less of that because more income needs to be available to other household members. Okay, and there's also various studies of personal consumption for different purposes. For instance, there's one for husbands and wives that basically just looks at husband and wife households. There are ones that look at, large families and so forth. So there may be more than one table that your economists can rely upon. So looking at this particular table, here we have the husband, what percentage of income. I'm going to look at this a little bit more closely so I can talk from it. My copy is kind of squinchy. Okay. And single persons, so you'll notice that over here to the far right, we have single persons, and they're consuming maybe about 80% of their income, as opposed to someone over here who's only consuming 60% because they have a wife or a family. Okay, this one's a little bit more easier to see. So this is for women. These numbers at the top, 1, 2, 3, 4, those are the number of people in the household. And over here to the left where it says income level, 20,000, 25,000, and so forth, that's the household income. And the numbers in the middle of the table are the percentages that person of household income that person would be expected to spend on themselves. So for a single female living by herself, whose household income is $20,000, they're going to spend even more than that comes in, because that's going to reflect perhaps some sort of government income payments or other, food stamps or whatever. They're getting some sort of income that they're not generating themselves, and they're spending more than they take in. So we go down to the $60,000 level. Okay, a single woman would be expected to spend about 60 to 65% of that on herself. Okay, if she's in a household unit with 5 members, personal consumption goes down to 13%. All right, so personal consumption is generally going to decrease, okay, with household income, and also decrease with the numbers of members of the household. Okay, and here's the full table all the way down to household income of $200,000 and maximum of 5 members. So a household income level of $200,000 in a 5-member household, her personal consumption goes down to 6.7%. okay? If she's a single woman with household income of 70%, she's going to be expected to consume 55 to 60% of it. Okay, same thing for males, again, okay? Males tend to consume slightly less than women, okay? And there's the full table, okay? All right. So very broadly speaking, the factors that are going to influence personal consumption rate are going to be household size. Okay, the larger the household, the smaller the personal consumption is going to be. Household income. As income rises, the amount that you're going to consume and spend on yourself goes down because there's more money. Okay, gender. Women consume slightly more than men. And also work status. There are personal consumption tables that divide people into people who are working and people who are retired. And retired people tend to spend less than working people, partly because their income tends to go down a little bit in retirement, but also they're sort of past the prime spending age. People 30 to 55 are advertisers and so forth. Those people tend to be thought of as consumer, and they're in the spending portion of their lives, and then it sort of declines as they age. Okay, questions about personal consumption? Okay, I've got one here. What if you have a very frugal or a very spendthrift decedent? Is it reasonable to use just an average range of expenditures found on the personal consumption tables? I think if you are able to get the records, for instance, if the decedent, let's say, had a gambling problem or bought a new Porsche every 5 years or never spent anything, and you had a way to document that, you could probably build those extra expenditures, or you could find the table or ranges where they're consuming the least and sort of try to tailor that to the plaintiff and explain it and show that you have the documentation to reflect that. You might have their bank records, or you might have, receipts for very large expenditures that they had regularly made over the last 10 years and so forth, so you could establish a pattern. Any other questions about, how is this impacted by same-sex households? Very good question. I had a wrongful death case in a same-sex household, and this question also came up in terms of household services. And I believe that what we did is we just look at the expenditure rate for men, if it was a two-male household, or the expenditure rate for women if it was a two-female household, or you may have to do a little bit of adjustment, or possibly take the male and the female and divide it by half and use a gender-neutral one. Okay, I'd answer your question. Okay, I'm going to move on. Okay, household services. All right, approaches to valuing household services. Basically, there are three. It would be using the minimum wage rate. It would be looking at the replacement value of the services. In other words, what is it going to cost to hire someone to replace the household services that the decedent or the injured person did, or the market value. And there are sources, people will do studies and determine what the market value of household services is. Okay, so this is sort of the bare bones minimum wage approach, and I've seen this predominantly in Texas. But there are some venues wherein sometimes lower income areas where putting a high dollar value on household services would appear to be extravagant. And sometimes people will just do a quick benchmark. How many hours did the person spend doing household services? What is the minimum wage? And that's sort of the value. Okay, so you would estimate the number of hours the plaintiff worked for a week, and then you would determine the minimum wage in that area and multiply the hours times the minimum wage times 52, and that would be your number. Okay, the drawbacks is that there's no real basis for the estimate of time that the decedent really spent performing household services. And in my experience, if you ask people to estimate it, it comes out to be very different from what the average is if you look at a reliable study. So that is sometimes not the best approach. Okay, and there's no basis for the intrinsic or the replacement value of the services other than minimum wage. On the other hand, it may be a palatable approach for juries in rural or low-income areas where recovering for household services would seem to be frivolous or overreaching, and it's very simple to present and understand, and you don't have to hire an expert to do it. Okay, replacement cost would be you're going to look in that particular market and determine what it's going to cost to replace the services of the plaintiff or the decedent. So, for instance, if the person drove people a lot or was a soccer mom, you might look at what it would cost to hire Uber to do that, or if the person, was a cook or did a lot of laundry and so forth, you're going to look at what's going to cost to bring somebody in to replace that. The drawback is usually you have to hire a vocational expert or an economist, and it's going to be time-consuming for them to call Mary Maids and get a quote and so forth. It's often difficult to find a proxy for all of the services performed. For instance, finding somebody who's going to come to the household and fix breakfast and fix lunch and fix dinner and do the laundry. It also may overstate the value of the service because when you're hiring this out, you're also paying agency profit and Social Security and a whole bunch of payroll expenses that you didn't have to pay your husband or your wife. And it may not be a fair comparison because you're looking at somebody who does this professionally versus somebody who did this within the household. On the other hand, it may be a reflection of what it would really cost if survivors attempted to replace services. For instance, if you had a stay-at-home mom and now you have a working husband and he has to hire a nanny, that's expensive. And if you just look at a dollar value of a day study, it may not reflect the actual cost of having someone come in and replace the services that and I shouldn't say mother, the stay-at-home parent actually performed. Okay. And then there's something that most economists rely on, which is the dollar value of a day, which actually provides an estimate of the amount of time people of different demographic backgrounds, whether they're working, non-working, retired, have children in the household, don't have any children in the household, are disabled. There's a wide range of choices, how much time they spend and how much that, and a benchmark for that cost. And the way they put this together is that there's a government study, again, it's called the American Time Use Survey, and what they do is they find Americans and they give them a time diary and they have them very precisely chart down exactly what they're doing every hour of the day, every minute, whether they're sleeping or they're watching children or they're watching children doing the laundry or they're cooking dinner and watching children and doing the laundry and so forth. And they record all that. But it's only for a 2-week period, okay? And then from that, they extrapolate how much time someone of a similar demographic background, whether it's a 75-year-old single male living at home or a 25-year-old mother of 3 who works part-time or whatever, how much time they would spend in household services. And every year when we get the headlines about how much more work men are doing at home than they did last year, they are drawing from the American Time Use Study, which is the ATIS, okay? So, and then what this study does, it then puts wage values on each of those types of services. So it will go out and look at what someone in a certain market is paying for maids, or if it's for valuing driving people on errands, what chauffeurs are paid or taxi drivers are paid within that market, and it puts a wage rate on that particular service. Okay, so the drawbacks may be that the time estimates don't reflect the actual time spent by the plaintiff or the decedent, but if you have that data, you can adjust the hours per week. The wage rates, like the market rates, may not reflect the actual value of the services performed by the plaintiff or the decedent, and the study can be used to suggest that plaintiff performed round-the-clock services. For instance, there are some people who consider the time that somebody spent sleeping to be nighttime protective services because in the case of a fire or an intruder or a crying child, that person could spring up and handle the situation, and that's worth money. Okay, so the virtues are that it uses the U.S. government study to estimate the time spent performing services, so that is seldom challenged, and the wage rates by are performed by geographical area. It's the same sort of data that we saw when I was pointing out those occupational wage rates. You can adjust it for any corner of the United States and get a precise benchmark for that geographic area. Okay. Any questions about household services? Okay. All right. So now I'm going to move on to using actuarial data to project the period of loss. And this is life expectancy tables, healthy life expectancy tables, work life expectancy tables, and other actuarial data. So when economists are projecting forward what the future economic damages of somebody will be, and we have to look at how long they would be expected to live, how long they would be expected to perform household services, how long they would be expected to work at their job, we want to get a reliable benchmark. And for that, we will go to actuarial tables to give us that data. So for instance, when we're projecting life expectancy, generally what economists will use is the United States life tables, and they come out every year. And they determine what the life expectancy of somebody is going to be based on the age they are now, their gender, and they are also available by race. So that's one thing that we'll look at. Okay, now California, as we have seen, is going to prevent the use of life expectancy tables that measure life expectancy according to race or sex. So in that instance, you may want to use, they'll have all races and all genders, and you can use a gender race neutral life expectancy table, although you may lose some precision when you move to that. Okay, some venues, for instance, Washington State has their own life expectancy tables, and you have to use theirs. So you may, if you're in a particular venue, you may want to find out what venue, what life expectancy table do you use to determine life in a civil case if it's not the U.S. Vital Statistics. Okay, and then some companies, if you have an unusual situation, for instance, you may have a plaintiff or a decedent who otherwise had a medical condition that such that you wouldn't expect them to live to a normal life expectancy anyway, independent of the tort, you can hire an expert to determine an individual life expectancy based on whatever factors accrued to that particular plaintiff. Okay, and here's an example of a life expectancy table, and we'll start out, here's your age, okay, and there's the expectation of life. So when we all start out in the United States, and this is for the total population, so this is all races, all genders. At age 0, we expect to live 78.6 years. Now, the thing about that you should know about life expectancy tables and work life expectancy tables is that the longer you live, the longer you're expected to live. So if you're age 65 and you're still working, you've probably got, even though you've reached what would be retirement age for some people, the fact that you've survived this long and are still working means that you're probably expected to work a little bit more. So even when we get up to age 96 and 97, you'll say that a 96-year-old has a life expectancy of 2.9 years, all right, because they've survived this long. So what we found is that they're expected to live a little bit more. Okay. Healthy life expectancy is generally used as a determination of when somebody could be expected to stop performing household services. Some economists don't believe in the healthy life expectancy metric, and they just cut off household services 2 years before the date of death, or 3 years before the date of death, or 1 year before the date of death, just as a matter of practice. But healthy life expectancy is generally the number of years that the person perceives himself to be healthy and to sort of be able to address the activities of daily living. Okay, so if we look at healthy life expectancy, this is for, again, all races, all genders. At age 0, we would be expected, the that's going to be the E H of X column. We'd be expected to be able to perform everything up to about the age of 67, then have some trouble. If we have the little f over here in the far right, 7003, that's full function. And then our life expectancy is to, as we saw before, that's the E of X, is to age 78. I'm sorry I don't have a pointer, so I can only verbally refer to this. But even as we get up to age 100, as we say, we still have we have about 2.2 more years expected to live. We would be expected to have a healthy life expectancy of about half a year and full function of about 0.8 of a year. Okay, work-life expectancy. Work-life tables are going to measure the number of years that the plaintiff or decedent would have been expected to be active in the workforce based on their age, gender, and level of education. Okay, and there are even some detailed work-life expectancy tables that are occupation specific. And you can look up what that person does and determine their work-life expectancy. Okay, important thing about work-life expectancy is it's going to measure the number of years that a person is active in the workforce. And active in the workforce means that they are either working in a job or actively seeking a job. Okay, it's not measuring the number of years that remain until retirement, because it's going to take into account periods where people are inactive in the workforce. Maybe women, for instance, have taken themselves out of the workforce to raise children, and then they're expected to go back in. So it's going to be the number of years based on the age that they are, that they're either going to be actively seeking a job or working in a job. So somebody might expect to retire at 65 or 67, but their work-life expectancy wouldn't be the number of years from now until age 67. It may be less than that because there may be various reasons that they're going to be taken out of the workforce. So it's a more conservative measure than just looking at the age at which they expect to retire and assuming that they have that many more years of earnings ahead of them. Okay, and this is a work-life expectancy table. So for instance, here we have, this is an initially active woman with a professional or doctoral degree. At age 26, she's going to expect to have about 38, where it says WLE mean 38 more years on average ahead of her. Or if we look at the median, that is 50% people would be expected to work longer and 50% would be expected to work less, about 38.5. Okay. Work-life expectancy also tells us sort of the probabilities of working longer than that. Okay, so if we go over here where it says age 26 and we go all the way over to the 90th percentile, okay, the top 10% of women might be expected to work 48.5 years longer. Okay, but that's the top 10%. Okay. And the top 75% might be expected to work 43.5 years longer. Okay, so if we had somebody who's age 26 and the economist is projecting that they're going to work for 50 more years, we might say, well, that may be possible, but it isn't probable because we know only the top 10% of people age 26, spend 50 straight years in the labor force. Okay. And then if we look at, and generally, the more education you have, the longer you're expected to be able to work. So the less education you have tends to have a shortening effect on work-life expectancy. So here's someone who's age 18, work-life expectancy is expected to be about 32 years, okay, about 5 years less than somebody who has a professional or doctoral degree. Okay. Other actuarial data. Very often if somebody is a member of a pension plan, they will have an annual report for the pension plan that has actuarial probabilities, and you can construct a work-life table out of that data and determine precisely how long that person would be expected to work. And it's generally more precise than using a work-life table based on education, because this person is actually in this particular kind of job. For instance, if it's a union pension plan, they may be pipe fitters, or they may be plumbers, or they may be somebody who does physical work. They may have, they may get full pension benefits at a particular age, so they have an incentive to retire at a certain point. Same thing for police and firefighters. Very often those pension plans, they don't want people working unless they're in management. They don't want people out there working as a police officer when they're older, so they have very heavy incentives for people to retire earlier. So if you have someone who's a member of a pension plan, you may want to ask your economist to look at the pension data and see how long that's going to tell you how long they would work. Okay, if somebody has medical conditions, okay, independent medical experts or treating physicians can offer an opinion about somebody's probable life expectancy. Okay, and there are other sources that may provide data about the expected tenure in a job or with an employer, the most probable age of retirement. If it's a large company, they may have the most common retirement age, or an attrition rate, how long people tend to stay there. And some professions, for instance, if you're a member of the FBI, you have to retire at 55. If you're a commercial pilot, after a certain age, you can't fly. So that it makes sense, if you have a job like that, to tend to look at what restrictions are there on how long you're expected to work. Okay, and I'm going to break for a question there because I have a question for the next section. Where can the consumption tables be found? You can Google them and they will come up. I have a source, it's just the Skug-Shieka work-life the consumption tables, I'm sorry. There are Patton Nelson, there are Kurt Kruger. I would Google personal consumption and see what comes up. I'd also look, if you look at the Journal of Forensic Economics, if you go on there, you can do a search under personal consumption. You will have, if you're not a member of NAFI, you will have to pay for it, but you can download the PDF article and have it for yourself. Okay, so I'm going to go on to valuing income in retirement. So not only so if somebody's injured, not only may they have lost earnings, but you also have to go all the way out and say, have they lost anything in retirement? In other words, if they had pre-injury earnings were at a certain level and their post-injury earnings are expected to be lower, that's going to have an effect on what Social Security benefit they eventually get when they retire and collect Social Security. Or it may have an effect on their pension, or it may have, if they have some sort of annuity retirement plan that's based on their earnings level or the number of years they worked or so forth, the effect of the personal injury on earnings can go all the way over their entire life. So we have to look at the effect of what happened to them on retirement earnings. Okay, so workers who are employees are legally bound to participate in Social Security. So almost everyone is going to be a member of Social Security unless they're in a state government job where they're, or a federal job where they're prevented from paying into Social Security and they instead have an alternate retirement plan. Okay, so future Social Security benefits, the Social Security website has a couple of calculators. One of them is a very detailed one that you can download, but I wouldn't recommend that. But they also have an online calculator where you can pretty much just punch in the level of earnings that they have now and when they're expected to retire and get an estimate of what their future Social Security earnings are going to be. And you can do that, if they hadn't been injured, what do we expect their Social Security benefit to be? And now that they are and they're earning less, what if, what's their projected Social Security benefit now? And the difference between them is going to be the loss. Okay, Social Security also provides disability benefits for permanently injured workers and survivors and the widows and children of decedents. Okay, so the payout of benefits in retirement, in other words, we all pay into Social Security. If you look at your W-2, we pay in 6.2% of income, and our employer pays in 6.2% of income, and then when we retire, we get this payout. So if you're going to project a loss of Social Security, you also deduct from earnings what you're going to pay into it because it costs you some. Okay. Also, for people, this is something that's often very helpful when you're having difficulty getting an earning history on a plaintiff. And they don't remember where they worked for the past 10 years, or they worked for companies, but the companies went belly up and you can't subpoena their earnings record. One thing that you can look for is the itemized statement, Social Security itemized statement of earnings, which if you get a detailed one, and you have to go to Social Security and fill out a particular form, and the plaintiff has to request it, but it is going to list earnings by employer for every year that individual worked and paid into Social Security. And so sometimes if people have a spotty earnings history, it's a useful thing to have, because you actually have a documented record of what they earned and when and where. Okay? And if somebody is receiving Social Security benefits, they go up a little bit every year by a cost of living increase based on changes in the Consumer Price Index. So be aware that every year the amount of Social Security that somebody gets changes and goes up a little bit. Okay. Pension, union, and annuity retirement benefits. Some people, although they are a declining percentage of the workforce, are fortunate enough to receive a pension or a defined benefit plan. And that means that as they work, they pay money into a pension plan, and then when they retire, they're going to get a guaranteed benefit or a certain amount on a monthly basis until they die. Okay? So workers who have had to cease work prematurely due to injury or death may have had their benefits reduced because they're unable to continue to work to retirement age. So what an economist is going to do is say, okay, but for the injury, here's the number of hours or the number of years you would have worked, and this is what you would have made, and so you've experienced a pension loss, and we're going to go ahead and calculate that. Okay, usually the pension plan will have a summary plan description, which is a document that explains exactly how the benefit is calculated, and we'll go into that and look at the formula for the pension and calculate what it is that they have lost. Okay, injured workers may also be receiving disability retirement benefits, particularly if they were injured while they were working, but it may not be, what they receive in disability may not be as great as what they would have earned in retirement had they continued to work. Okay, and pensions also may or may not have a cost of living increase that increases the amount of benefit each year based on inflation. So that's another thing that you're going to want to look at. Is that benefit going to be increasing over time? Okay. Now, there are also offsets to lost benefits. And in certain circumstances, you can use them. For instance, if the decedent was going to receive a retirement pension but died, and there was an option in the pension plan that if something would happen to them and he or she did die, that his spouse would receive a benefit, okay? They may not have necessarily lost the benefit of that pension. For instance, in Social Security, if the recipient of Social Security dies, that benefit will be paid to their spouse. Okay, once they die, if it's higher than the spouse's benefit. The spouse may have worked and had a higher Social Security benefit. So pensions may not necessarily have been lost if there is a survivor option that continues payment to the person's survivors. Now, some venues will consider that to be a collateral source. In other words, that's something that the plaintiff did to protect themselves in case the decedent died, and you, the tortfeasor, the defendant, do not get to take that money and reduce your losses. But in some situations, for instance, in medical malpractice cases in California, courts allow you to do that. Okay, sure, he died. She lost a Social Security benefit, but she's getting a survivor's benefit, so we can use that to offset the loss. So you always want to look at whether, so it's worthwhile to check to see if the survivors are going to be receiving some sort of benefit in lieu of the benefit that was lost, and if so, if it's a valid offset, or if you can introduce evidence of it or even mention it, or say, in settlement negotiations, look, we know we can't introduce this, but we know she didn't really lose anything because she's getting, or he's getting the retirement benefit, and, economically, it's not really a loss. Okay, questions?
Thanks, Nora. If all the attendees can enter in the passcode for today, which is personal, and any questions you have, and I'm sending over the questions now to you, Nora.
Okay. All right. Does spending difference occur to race or religion? That's a very good question. I don't know. I'm not aware that the Consumer Expenditure Survey provides spending data on the basis of race, and it's never been anything I've been asked to look into, but it's an interesting question, and I'm going to look when I have a moment to do so. Okay, on household services, what are the strategic inquiries or information needed to both analyze and attack? Well, lost it. Hold on. Analyze, attack plaintiffs' calculations who use the area for a major case value inflator. All right, well, the first place that I would go to is the spouse's deposition, because as we all know, our spouses have a very different idea of the amount that we contribute to the household than we do. And you will often find very different accounts of what the spouse, well, what did you do around the house? And the spouse goes, ask the plaintiff, what did you do around the house? And it's like, I did this and this and this and this. And then you ask the spouse, what did they do? Oh, they did nothing, or I did all this, or all that sort of thing. So you may have that there, and sometimes the spouses have been coached. Oh, they did everything. We have an acre of backyard and they mowed it every week, and so forth. But that would be one place to go. The other thing to do is to look at something like the dollar value of the day, which is going to have very precise data on average of what people perform. And so, if on average, let's say somebody spends 8 hours a week, mothers of 3, you could even look at it, spend 8 hours a week fixing meals, and this particular plaintiff is claiming 20, you may want to question that. I've even looked at cases where when you added up the hours the plaintiff claimed to have spent working and the number of hours they claimed to have spent engaged in household services, you would find them living 30-hour days, which isn't possible. So the first thing you want to look at is logical. How much time would reasonably somebody be spent on that? And then look at, like time diaries, and how much people, how much time did they typically spend at work? If they spent this much time at work, how much time could they reasonably spend doing services at home? And if they claim a certain number of hours in household services at home, how much time does the typical, father of 3, single retired female, age 75, spend doing this? And then you start to get a benchmark. And then ask detailed questions. Okay, so they spent 20 hours a week doing the laundry. How many clothes were there for them to wash? So forth. Okay. What's that question? Okay. If your plaintiff is a caretaker for a disabled spouse or relative and no replacement help is acquired for reasons of cost prohibitions, how can you demand or make an argument for payment of the plaintiff's value of services to the disabled spouse or relative? Well, you still can. I think what you say is, we haven't received an award and we haven't been able to afford this kind of service. But this is what this person did. I think that's what I would do. The dollar value of a day will give a benchmark for that. Okay, and you could also look at, sort of what for in-home social service, IHSS, you could look at what wages those people would be paid that would be, something like that for people who have no assets, what it costs sort of for the state to go in and cover that. I think that would be something you could make a reasonable argument for. Okay, does it make a difference if the plaintiff or decedent has been working full-time or part-time? Yes, it does. And in terms of household services, it does. And the dollar value of the day will have categories for people who are working part-time and people who were not working at all and people who were working full-time. Okay, I'm going to move on. Okay, discounting to present value. I have this person holding his head by a bunch of complicated calculations because I find that whenever I am talking to anyone about net discount rates, I either get glazed eyes or an expression that looks like this. So I've put this together, and I'm just going to go over it very slowly and carefully so that everybody understands what discounting is and are not intimidated by it, because I find that when I get questions about discount rates, very often attorneys don't really understand it and are somewhat afraid of it. And I'd sort of like to demystify this, and it's simple math and everybody can get it. Okay? So very broadly speaking, okay, if what we're doing is we're going to be reducing future damages to present value. So the numbers are typically going to be lower than if we took whatever the annual earnings loss is and multiplied it by the number of years we expect the loss to take. Okay, and typical net discount rates, okay, are generally between 0 and 3%. Okay, so usually we're going to be discounting whatever the loss is as we go out year by year, maybe about 1% or 2% or possibly 3%, and taking a little bit off to account for the fact that once the plaintiff receives an award, they can invest the money and achieve an annual return on that, so that we don't want to overcompensate them. We want to account for the fact that when they get the award, they will be earning interest on it, which is generally the return on a very safe security like a government bond or U.S. Treasury, and that is going to accrue to their award as time goes on. Okay. So the first thing that we're going to do is when we're projecting lost wages, okay, so we're assuming that somebody is going to be earning a certain amount each year into the future, we're also going to be expecting wage increases, okay, because over time, generally there's inflation, prices go up a little bit more per year, and wages go up a little bit more per year. So we're going to first look at how wages are going to grow each year in the future. So let's assume that somebody's going to get a 3% raise every year. Okay? So we start off in 2013. They receive $50,000. In 2014, they get a 3% raise. That's equal to $1,500, 3% of $50,000. And so in 2014, they're going to earn $51,500. Okay, same thing in 2015. They get 3% raise of $51,500, and they're earning $53,045. 2016, they get another 3% raise. 2017. So very often when you see an economist report and you're looking at the annual loss and it's going up a little bit, that's what that person is doing. They're accounting for the fact that the person's wages would probably be expected to increase over time, and we're accounting for that. Okay, we're giving them credit for the raises they would have gotten in the future. Okay, so if we graph that, we might see this growing over time. Okay, expected salary is, okay, and that's the growth rate. So we're growing wages as we're going forward. Okay, okay, then we're going to take those future growth rates and we're going to discount the wages back to present value. Okay, we're going to reduce the future wages slightly to account for the time value of money. Okay, we can invest money today and it's going to be worth more in the future. So we want to know the amount of money that we can give the plaintiff today if they invested it in a safe investment. Okay, how much would that award grow over time to account for these future losses that we want to compensate them for. Okay? When we're projecting a discount rate or what we think the return on the award will be, we're going to use U.S. Treasury bonds. Okay, that's the safest investment because the government, if it wants to repay their debts, you're borrowing money from the government. When you invest in a U.S. Treasury bond, the government can always print more money and pay us back. Okay, but Treasury bonds have different dates of maturity. That's when the bond is repaid, from 90 days to 30 years. The longer the period to maturity, the highest the interest rate. Okay, so for instance, if you're going to loan money to the government for 30 years, you're going to expect them to pay you more in interest because they're tying up your money for a very long period of time than if you just loan them money for a year and you expect to be repaid in a year's time. Okay, so when we're discounting, we're going to take the future value, that is the wages that we grew. We're going to take 1 plus whatever the discount rate is. We're going to use 5%, so that's going to be the 1 point plus 0.0105. And then we're going to times the power of the number of years into the future, less half of a year. Okay, so if we take 50,000, we divide it by 1.0105%. Okay, for half a year, that 50,000 is discounted to present value, and it's worth 49,000. Same thing if we're going into year 2, we're going to take the 51,500 when we grew the wages 33% to get from 50,000 to 51,500. That was our growth rate, and now we're going to reduce it a little bit to account for the time value of money. Okay, and we're going to take 1 plus 105%, discount it for over the period of 1.5 years, and that's going to be worth $50,699. Okay? So here we go. Here's our former table where we're taking the 50,000, we're growing at 3% a year, 51,500, 5304, and then we're discounting it, okay, over the same period of time by 105%, okay? So we go so the present value of 50,000 is going to be 49,740. 51,500 is going to be 50,699, and so forth. So this is so if you look at the dark bands here, here's where we're growing the wages over time based on what we expect the wages to increase to. And then the lighter gray is we take that wage, we increased it by 3% to account for raises over time, and then we're discounting it back to what that money is going to be worth today. Okay? So it's going to be a little bit less than just the nominal value. Okay, so here we go. We have the expected salary. We have the total present value is going to be $258,483 based on our discounting. Okay. So I'm going to stop there. Questions?
Yes, if all the attendees can enter in the passcode and any questions that you have for Nora, their question is coming over.
Okay, I've got one right here. What is a reasonable discount rate or net discount rate? I would say generally speaking, anything less than 0 or over 3% for a long-term loss is going to be unusual, although there might be a valid reason for this given the circumstances of the particular case. Some economists don't discount the present value at all. What they say is that wage growth and the discounting we do to bring future losses back to present value are equivalent, so we don't have to discount this at all. But this has been disproven, so even though it's easy to explain to a jury, we have Joe Blow, he made $50,000 a year, he was expected to work 10 more years, therefore the losses are $500,000, we don't have to grow the wages, we don't have to discount them. That's been disproven. So generally you are going to have to look at how those wages would have increased over time and what they would be worth today. Okay, are there different rules when decedent or injured party had a subchapter S corporation? Yes. you're going to have to look at, it depends. It depends on how they're paid. If they were just paid based on their distributions, you would look at that. They may have also been paid wages out of the corporation. So you have to look at the total money that they're being paid. And sometimes you may not just want to look at the distributions, but you want to look at the percentage ownership and what the corporation was really generating, because they may not take the full income of the subchapter S corporation in distributions. They may only be taking a part of that and investing the rest back into the company, but it still belongs to them. Okay, so putting this all together, I'm going to do this fast because we're at 12:30. We're going to look at an actual report and talk a little bit about what we've learned. So this is the summary of economic loss from an actual wrongful death case. And this particular person was a union electrician. So we have loss of support, lost wages and benefits. And you'll see if we look at the total loss, this person had they continued to work and earn to their work-life expectancy, losses are taken out until the point at which they would be expected to stop working, or the number of years they would have expected to be working and earning. It's about $600,000. Okay, this person also paid into Social Security, so they would be, because they didn't live to a normal life expectancy, they never got to retirement. They lost a certain amount of money in Social Security retirement benefits. In this case, $235,000. Okay, this person also had a union pension. Okay, so this was a small international pension, not worth a whole lot, $8,800, and then they also had a national electricians benefit fund pension. Losses would be $66,000, and then quite a few household services. Okay, because person had children and also would have been performing, died fairly young, so we've got about $300,000 in household services. So all told, total losses to the survivors are $1,237,693. How did we get there? Okay, this is a table showing their lost earnings. So you'll notice that we have losses right here up to the end of work-life expectancy, which is that boxed number. But there was also an alternative calculation where we took this plaintiff out to age 70. Why did we do that? He had 2 children. And I calculated when the youngest child would be age 22, that would be about when they were 70. So if this person was expected to keep working in order to put the children through college, we've got a much longer period of earnings down there at the bottom. I also did a separate analysis, which is the totals that we looked at, where I just took them out to work-life expectancy, which is this boxed number. So sometimes you can build in 2 alternative scenarios into an analysis, let the jury decide how long they think the person would have worked. And there may be reasons why somebody would expect, as we said, this individual might be expected to work longer than the average person. Okay, this is lost retirement. So this is this person's lost Social Security. So we take it up until the future. Person was expected to retire around, I can't really read that number, I think it's 2026. And Social Security benefit was about $23,000. We cost that out to the end of this person's life expectancy, and we get to total Social Security losses. Then these were household services. Okay, so we've got this person's rate. They retire. Value of household services goes up from about $12,000 to $21,000 because they have more time to spend in household services. Take that out to their healthy life expectancy, and we've got about $300,000 worth of household services. And there we are. Any questions at the end? And thank you so much. That was a long haul, but I hope you've learned something. And feel free to email me with any questions that you have, or if you have a particular case that you have a specific question about, send me an email and I can arrange a time to discuss it with you.
we don't have any time for added questions, so we'll send those directly over to you.
Okay, and then just bear with me because I'll be traveling for the rest of the week, but I will, once I get your email question, I'll acknowledge it, and I will get back to you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Please remember that
Thank you,
if you are applying, please remember that if you are applying for CLE credit, you must have attended for the full 90 minutes of this presentation. You are also required to complete the survey at the end of the program. Please note that all certificates will be sent out via email in 24 to 48 hours. I want to take this opportunity to thank everyone for attending, and most especially Nora Ostrofe for her time and effort in creating this presentation. If you would like to speak with Nora, or if you would like to speak with a TASA representative regarding the expert witness for a case that you are working on, please contact TASA at 1-800-523-2319. One of my colleagues will be following up with you regarding your feedback on today's presentation. Again, thank you all for attending. This concludes our program for today.